The email notification chimed on my laptop just as I was arranging fresh lilies in the crystal vase David had given me for my 60th birthday. Mom, we need to talk. It's time you faced reality about your living situation. We're adults now with our own families to think about. We don't need you hovering over us anymore. Jessica and I have found the perfect assisted living community for you. It's called Golden Years Manor, and honestly, you'll be much happier there with people your own age. We've already put down a deposit. The move-in date is next month. Love, David. I read the message 3 times, each reading making my hands shake more violently than the last. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Eleanor Whitman, and at 68 years old, I thought I knew what betrayal felt like. I was wrong. Nothing had prepared me for the cold, clinical way my son David and his wife Jessica had just informed me that they were discarding me like an outdated piece of furniture. I sank into my favorite armchair, the one Harold and I had picked out together 43 years ago when we first bought this house, and tried to process what I had just read. The email wasn't even addressed to me personally. It was signed, Love, David, but there was nothing loving about the tone. It read like a business memo, efficiently disposing of an inconvenient problem. I was that problem. The woman who had carried David for 9 months, who had stayed up countless nights when he was sick, who had worked double shifts as a nurse to pay for his college education, who had been there for every milestone, every heartbreak, every triumph of his 35 years of life. I thought about all the times over the past 2 years since Harold's death that David and Jessica had assured me I was family. How they'd insisted I was always welcome at their house. How they'd told their children, my grandchildren, that Grandma Eleanor was an important part of their lives. How Jessica had held my hand at Harold's funeral and promised I would never be alone. How David had given that touching eulogy about how his father had raised him to always take care of family. Apparently taking care of family had an expiration date. I walked to my kitchen window and looked out at the garden Harold and I had spent decades cultivating. The roses were in full bloom, the vegetable patch was thriving, and the bird feeders were attracting the cardinals I loved to watch each morning with my coffee. This was my sanctuary, my home, the place where every room held memories of a life well lived. And my son wanted me to abandon it all because it was convenient for him. The phone rang, and I saw Jessica's name on the caller ID. For a moment, I considered not answering, but my ingrained politeness won out. Hello, Eleanor? Jessica's voice was bright and cheerful, as if she hadn't just participated in upending my entire life. I hope you got David's email. I wanted to follow up because I know this is a big change, but honestly, I think you're going to love Golden Years Manor. I drove by yesterday and the grounds are absolutely beautiful. I found my voice, though it sounded strange and distant to my own ears. Jessica, I haven't agreed to move anywhere. This is my home. There was a pause, and when Jessica spoke again, her tone had shifted from cheerful to patronizing. Eleanor, I know change is hard, especially at your age, but you have to be realistic. This house is far too big for one person. David and I are constantly worried about you living here alone. What if you fall? What if there's an emergency? What if you forget to turn off the stove or lock the doors? What if? What if? What if? Every hypothetical scenario designed to make me feel incompetent and unsafe in my own home. I've been managing just fine, thank you, I said, my voice gaining strength. I'm 68, not 98. I'm in excellent health, I drive, I cook, I maintain this house and garden. I don't need to be warehoused in some facility. Jessica's laugh was light, but there was an edge to it. Oh, Eleanor, you're being so dramatic. It's not a warehouse, it's a community. Think of all the friends you'll make, all the activities they have planned. No more worrying about yard work or house maintenance. No more being lonely. Honestly, I think you've been isolated here for too long since Harold passed. It's not healthy. Isolated. As if my book club, my volunteer work at the hospital, my garden club, my weekly coffee dates with my neighbor Martha, and my regular video calls with my sister in Portland didn't exist. As if the rich, full life I'd built for myself after Harold's death was somehow inadequate because it didn't revolve around David and Jessica's schedule. What about Emma and Tyler? I asked, referring to my 10 and 12-year-old grandchildren. How do they feel about this move? Another pause. Well, they don't really understand adult decisions yet, but they'll adjust. Golden Years Manor has visiting hours, and will bring them to see you regularly. Maybe not as often as now, since it's a bit of a drive, but definitely for holidays and special occasions. Visiting hours, like I was already a patient in some institution. Like my relationship with my grandchildren was something to be scheduled and managed, rather than the natural, organic bond we developed through countless sleepovers, baking sessions, garden adventures, and bedtime stories. I need time to think about this, I said finally. Of course, but Eleanor, don't take too long. We've already paid the deposit, and there's a waiting list for the nicer units. The move-in date is firm. We've scheduled the moving company for the 15th of next month. David thought it would be easier if we handled all the logistics for you. They'd scheduled the moving company. They'd paid deposits. They'd made decisions about my life, my home, my future, without consulting me. The audacity was breathtaking. I have to go, I managed to say. Okay, but Eleanor, please try to see this as a positive thing. We're doing this because we love you and want what's best for you. Sometimes children have to make hard decisions for their parents, just like parents do for their children. The comparison made my stomach turn. I was not a child. I was a grown woman with decades of life experience, financial independence, and complete mental faculties. The fact that Jessica thought she could speak to me like I was a confused toddler revealed everything I needed to know about how she truly saw me. After hanging up, I sat in my living room and tried to understand how I had become such a burden to my own family. For the past 2 years, I'd been careful not to be needy or demanding. I'd rebuilt my life after Harold's death, finding new interests and maintaining old friendships. I'd been proud of my independence, my resilience, my ability to create joy and purpose even in the face of profound loss. But apparently, my independence was threatening to David and Jessica. My ability to live well without constant family involvement made them uncomfortable. They wanted me to need them, to be grateful for their attention, to fit neatly into whatever role they'd assigned me in their lives. When I proved I could thrive on my own, they decided the solution was to remove my autonomy entirely. I thought about Harold and what he would say if he could see this situation. He'd always been protective of our privacy and independence. Eleanor, he used to say, the minute you let other people start making your decisions for you is the minute you stop living your own life. He'd been talking about well-meaning friends who wanted to set us up with activities or social groups we weren't interested in, but the principle applied here too. Harold had also been very clear about David. I love our son. He'd told me during one of our last conversations before the cancer took him, but he's always been a follower. He marries strong-willed women and lets them make the big decisions. Just remember that if anything ever happens to me. David's a good man, but he's easily influenced. At the time, I thought Harold was being overly critical. David had always been a loving, attentive son. But now I wondered if Harold had seen something I'd missed. Had David always been this willing to let others control his relationships? Had Jessica been orchestrating this isolation gradually, convincing David that his mother was becoming a burden, a responsibility, an obstacle to their perfect family life? I walked upstairs to Harold's study, which I'd left largely unchanged since his death. His books still lined the shelves. His reading glasses still sat on the desk next to a half-finished crossword puzzle. In the bottom drawer of his filing cabinet, I found what I was looking for: our will and estate planning documents. Harold had always been meticulous about financial planning, and he'd made sure I understood every aspect of our arrangements. Reading through the papers, I was reminded of how carefully Harold had structured everything. Our assets were substantial, the result of 40 years of careful saving and investing. The house was worth approximately $400,000, and our retirement accounts and investments totaled another $600,000. There was also a life insurance policy worth $250,000 that had paid out when Harold died. In total, I was worth over $1 million. According to our current will, everything would go to David when I died. We'd set it up that way because he was our only child, and we'd trusted him to use the inheritance wisely, to take care of his own children's education and future needs. Harold had even included a provision that if David predeceased me, everything would go to Emma and Tyler in trust until they reached 25. But as I sat in Harold's chair reading these documents, I realized that my son and daughter-in-law weren't just trying to control my living situation. They were positioning themselves to control my assets. If I was in an assisted living facility, it would be much easier for them to gradually take over my financial affairs. They could argue that I was no longer capable of managing my own money, that they needed to help me navigate the complex world of investments and estate planning. I remembered a conversation I'd overheard last Christmas when David and Jessica thought I was napping in the guest room. Jessica had been talking about how much money assisted living facilities cost, how quickly they could drain someone's savings, how important it was to plan ahead for those expenses. At the time, I'd assumed she was being thoughtful, concerned about my future financial security. Now I wondered if she'd been calculating how much of my money would be left for David to inherit. The more I thought about it, the more the pieces fell into place. Over the past year, Jessica had made several comments about how expensive it was to raise children these days, how they were struggling to save for Emma and Tyler's college funds, how David's salary as a high school principal wasn't keeping up with inflation. She'd never directly asked for money, but she'd made sure I was aware of their financial pressures. And I'd responded exactly as she'd hoped. I'd quietly paid for Emma's piano lessons and Tyler's baseball equipment. I'd bought them expensive Christmas and birthday gifts. I'd contributed to their college funds without being asked. I'd thought I was being a helpful grandmother, supporting my family in meaningful ways. But Jessica had probably seen it as proof that I had money to spare, money that would eventually belong to them anyway. The phone rang again, and this time, it was David. His voice was gentler than Jessica's had been, but there was an underlying firmness that reminded me uncomfortably of Harold when he'd made up his mind about something. "Mom, I know this is a big adjustment, but I really think you'll like Golden Years Manor once you see it. Jessica and I visited last week, and the staff seems wonderful. They have movie nights and craft classes and even a small library." "David," I interrupted, "when did you and Jessica decide I needed to move? Was this something you've been planning for a while?" He was quiet for a moment. "We've been talking about it since Dad died, honestly. We've just been worried about you."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Being alone in that big house. And lately we've noticed some changes. What kind of changes? Well, you've seemed more forgetful. Last month when we came for dinner, you asked me 3 times if I wanted more coffee. And you've been repeating stories sometimes, telling us things you've already told us. Jessica thinks it might be the beginning of some age-related memory issues. I felt like I'd been slapped. The coffee incident he was referring to had happened during a particularly stressful evening, when Jessica had spent the entire dinner criticizing my pot roast and suggesting ways I could improve my recipe. I'd been nervous and distracted, trying to be a good hostess while dealing with her passive-aggressive comments. And yes, I sometimes repeated stories, but that was because David and Jessica rarely seemed to be listening when I talked. They were always checking their phones or making comments to each other about their own lives. "David, there's nothing wrong with my memory. I manage my own finances, I drive safely, I take care of this house and garden without any help. If I seemed distracted during dinner last month, it's because I was trying to be polite while your wife criticized everything I served." "Mom, that's not fair. Jessica was just trying to help. She used to be a chef, remember? She knows about cooking." Jessica had worked as a line cook at a chain restaurant for 6 months 15 years ago, hardly the credentials of a culinary expert. But David had always elevated Jessica's limited experiences into impressive expertise. Her brief stint in food service made her a chef. Her 2 years of community college made her an expert on education policy. Her 1 psychology class made her qualified to diagnose my supposed memory problems. "Son, I need you to listen to me very carefully," I said, using the voice I'd perfected during 40 years of nursing, the voice that made doctors and patients pay attention. "I am not moving to an assisted living facility. This is my home, and I'm perfectly capable of living here independently. I don't know why you and Jessica have decided I'm incompetent, but you're wrong. Mom, please don't make this harder than it has to be. We've already made the arrangements, and honestly, we can't afford to lose the deposit. Golden Years Manor isn't cheap, and we had to use some of Emma's college fund to secure your spot. They'd used my granddaughter's college fund. Money that was supposed to ensure Emma's future had been spent to warehouse me in an institution I'd never agreed to enter. The manipulation was stunning in its audacity. Now, if I refused to go, I wouldn't just be disappointing David and Jessica, I'd be taking money away from my granddaughter's education. David, why didn't you discuss this with me before you spent Emma's college money? Why didn't you ask what I wanted? Because we knew you'd resist change, even if it was for your own good. Mom, you're not getting any younger, and this house is becoming too much for you, whether you want to admit it or not. Last time I was there, I noticed the upstairs bathroom faucet was dripping, and there were leaves in the gutters. What happens when you can't keep up with the maintenance? What happens if you fall down those stairs? What happens if you have a medical emergency and nobody finds you for days? Every concern he raised was hypothetical. Every worry was based on what might happen rather than what was actually happening. I was in excellent health for my age. I had regular checkups with my doctor, who had pronounced me fit and alert just 3 months ago. I had friends who checked on me regularly, and I'd already discussed with Martha, my next-door neighbor, the possibility of setting up a daily check-in system if I ever felt it was necessary. But David and Jessica weren't interested in actual solutions or real conversations about my future needs. They decided what was best for me and expected me to be grateful for their management of my life. I have to go, I told David. I need time to think about all of this. Mom, there isn't much time. The move-in date that you scheduled without consulting me, I interrupted. Goodbye, David. After hanging up, I walked through my house with new eyes. This wasn't just my home. It was my fortress. Every room represented my independence, my ability to make my own choices, my right to live life on my own terms. The kitchen where I cooked meals I actually enjoyed, instead of trying to please Jessica's impossible standards. The living room where I could watch my mystery shows without David sighing about how unrealistic the plots were. The garden where I could spend hours nurturing plants without anyone commenting about how I should hire someone to do the heavy work. I thought about Harold's cancer diagnosis and how we'd faced that challenge together, making decisions based on medical reality rather than other people's fears and assumptions. We'd researched treatment options, consulted with specialists, weighed the pros and cons of different approaches. We'd made informed choices based on facts, not emotions or convenience. David and Jessica were asking me to give up my independence based on their anxieties and their financial calculations, not on any actual evidence that I couldn't care for myself. They were treating me like I was already incapacitated, rather than like a competent adult who deserved to be consulted about major life decisions. I made myself a cup of tea and sat in Harold's study, surrounded by his books and papers. Somewhere in this house, I knew I could find the strength and wisdom to fight back. Harold had always said that the best defense against bullies was to be smarter, more prepared, and more determined than they were. It was time to start treating David and Jessica like the bullies they'd become. The next morning, I called my attorney, Robert Morrison, who had handled Harold's estate and our various legal needs for the past 20 years. Robert was a thoughtful man in his 60s who specialized in elder law and estate planning. When I explained the situation, he was quiet for a long moment. "Eleanor, what they're proposing is concerning on several levels," he said finally. "First, you have every right to remain in your own home, as long as you're competent and capable of caring for yourself. Second, the fact that they've made financial commitments without your consent suggests they may be overstepping their bounds already. Have you given David or Jessica any power of attorney?" "No, Harold and I never saw the need. We always made decisions together, and after he died, I've been managing everything myself without any problems." "Good. That means they have no legal authority to make these decisions for you. Eleanor, I have to ask, do you think David and Jessica might be motivated by financial considerations? Your estate is substantial, and if you were in assisted living, it might be easier for them to gradually take control of your assets. Hearing Robert voice my own suspicions was both validating and frightening. I think that's exactly what they're doing. They've been making comments about money, about how expensive it is to raise children, about needing help with college funds. And now they've used Emma's college money to pay a deposit at this facility. That's a concerning pattern. Eleanor, I think we need to take some proactive steps to protect your interests. First, I'd recommend getting a comprehensive medical evaluation to document your mental and physical competency. Second, we should review your estate planning documents and consider making some changes. Third, we need to establish clear legal boundaries to prevent David and Jessica from making any more unilateral decisions about your life. Robert scheduled an appointment for later that week to review my legal options in detail. Before hanging up, he gave me one piece of advice that resonated deeply. Eleanor, remember that you don't owe anyone an explanation for wanting to live your own life. Your age doesn't diminish your right to make decisions about your own future. The relief I felt after talking to Robert was enormous. For the first time since receiving David's email, I felt like I had some control over the situation. I wasn't just a problem to be solved or a burden to be managed. I was a competent adult with rights, resources, and options. I spent the rest of the day doing things that brought me joy and proved my independence. I baked bread from scratch, tended my garden, balanced my checkbook, and called 3 old friends from my nursing days. Each conversation reminded me of who I was beyond my role as David's mother, or Jessica's convenient target. My friend Margaret, who'd worked with me in the pediatric unit for 15 years, was appalled when I told her about David and Jessica's plan. "Eleanor, that's outrageous," she said. "You're one of the most competent people I know. Remember how you used to handle those difficult doctors who thought they could intimidate the nursing staff? You never backed down when you knew you were right." She was right. In my professional life, I'd been known for my backbone, my unwillingness to be bullied or dismissed. I'd advocated fiercely for my patients, challenged doctors when I thought they were making mistakes, and stood up to administrators who tried to cut corners on patient care. Somewhere along the way, in my eagerness to be a loving mother and grandmother, I'd forgotten how to advocate for myself. That evening, I called my sister Patricia in Portland. Patricia was 5 years older than me and had always been my closest confidant. When I told her about David's email and Jessica's phone calls, she was furious. "Eleanor, this is ridiculous. You're in better shape than I am, and I'm still working full-time at 73. David and that wife of his have been trying to control you since Harold died. Remember last year when they insisted you shouldn't drive to Portland to visit me? They said it was too far and too dangerous, but you've been making that drive for decades." I'd forgotten about that incident, but Patricia was right. David and Jessica had been gradually chipping away at my independence for months, questioning my abilities, expressing concern about activities I'd been doing safely for years. They'd been laying the groundwork for this moment, creating a narrative that I was becoming frail and incompetent. "What are you going to do?" Patricia asked. "I'm going to fight," I said, and as the words left my mouth, I felt something shift inside me. "I'm going to remind them that I'm not dead yet. And I'm not going quietly into whatever institution they've picked out for me." Patricia laughed, and I heard approval in her voice. "There's the Eleanor I know. Harold would be proud of you." After talking to Patricia, I felt more like myself than I had in months. I wasn't a helpless widow waiting for her children to manage her life. I was Eleanor Whitman, a woman who'd spent 4 decades saving lives, who'd raised a son, who'd built a marriage and a home and a community. I was someone worth fighting for. The next few days were filled with phone calls and appointments as I began building my defense against David and Jessica's plans. I scheduled a comprehensive physical and cognitive evaluation with my primary care physician, Dr. Sarah Chen, who'd been my doctor for the past 10 years. I met with a financial planner to review my assets and ensure they were properly protected. I even consulted with a real estate attorney about my rights as a homeowner. Each professional I spoke with confirmed what I already knew. I was competent, capable, and well within my rights to refuse David and Jessica's plans. Dr. Chen was particularly supportive, noting that my physical and mental health were excellent for my age, and that there was no medical reason I couldn't continue living independently. "Eleanor," she said after completing my evaluation, "I see patients in their 40s who aren't as sharp or as healthy as you are. The fact that your family is trying to institutionalize you based on hypothetical future problems is concerning. You're not showing any signs of cognitive decline, physical frailty, or inability to care for yourself." Armed with medical documentation of my competency, I felt ready to face whatever David and Jessica threw at me next. But I wasn't prepared for their next move, which came in the form of an unexpected visit from Emma and Tyler. On Thursday afternoon, just as I was finishing lunch, I heard car doors slam in my driveway. Through the window, I saw David's car, and my heart raced as I wondered what new confrontation awaited me. But when the doorbell rang, it was Emma and Tyler standing on my porch, looking uncertain and sad. "Grandma Eleanor," Emma said as I opened the door, "can we come in? Dad said we needed to talk to you about something important." I hugged them both tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of Emma's strawberry shampoo and Tyler's grape bubblegum. These children were the lights of my life, and seeing them looking so serious and confused broke my heart. "Of course, sweetheart. Are your parents here?" "They're waiting in the car," Tyler said. "They said this was something we needed to do ourselves." We settled in the living room and I waited for them to explain their visit. Emma, who at 10 was already showing signs of the thoughtful, articulate young woman she would become, took the lead. "Grandma, Dad, and Mom told us you're moving to a place called Golden Years Manor. They said you can't live here anymore because it's not safe, and that we should be excited because you'll have lots of new friends and fun activities." Tyler, who was 12 and going through an awkward phase where he seemed to consist entirely of elbows and knees, shifted uncomfortably on the couch. "But we don't want you to move, Grandma. We like coming here. We like your house and your garden and how you let us help you bake cookies." My throat tightened with emotion. "What else did your parents tell you?" Emma looked down at her hands. "They said you might be sad about moving, but that sometimes grown-ups have to do things they don't want to do. They said we should tell you that we'll still love you even if you live somewhere else, and that we'll visit you lots." The manipulation was breathtaking. David and Jessica had sent these innocent children to deliver a message that was designed to make me feel guilty for resisting their plans. They were using Emma and Tyler's love for me as emotional blackmail, making them complicit in their scheme without the children even understanding what was happening. I took a deep breath and chose my words carefully. "Emma, Tyler, I want you to know that I'm not moving anywhere. This is my home, and I'm perfectly happy and safe here. Your parents are worried about things that might happen in the future, but there's nothing wrong with me now." Tyler's face brightened immediately. "So we can still come over and help you with the garden?" "Of course, sweetie. And we can still have our Saturday morning pancake breakfasts and our movie nights." Emma looked confused. "But Dad said you already agreed to move. He said the deposit was paid and everything." This was the moment I realized how far David and Jessica were willing to go in their manipulation. They'd lied to their own children, using them as messengers in a campaign to pressure me into compliance. They'd made Emma and Tyler believe that I'd agreed to abandon them, that I was choosing to leave their lives. "Emma, I never agreed to move anywhere. Your father and Jessica made those decisions without asking me what I wanted. But I want you both to know that whatever happens, I will always be your grandmother, and I will always love you more than anything in the world." Tyler threw his arms around me. "I'm so glad you're not moving, Grandma. I was really scared we wouldn't be able to see you as much." Emma was more thoughtful, her young mind working through the implications of what I'd told her. "Grandma, if you didn't agree to move, why do Mom and Dad think you did?" It was a fair question, and one that deserved an honest answer. Sometimes adults make mistakes, sweetheart. Sometimes they think they know what's best for other people, without asking what those people actually want. We spent the next hour doing normal grandparent and grandchildren things. We played board games, looked through photo albums, and baked chocolate chip cookies. As we worked in the kitchen, Emma and Tyler chattered about school, their friends, their plans for the summer. They were happy, normal children who clearly felt safe and loved in my home. When David and Jessica finally came to the door to collect them, the contrast was stark. The children were relaxed and cheerful, while their parents looked tense and uncomfortable. Jessica barely made eye contact with me, while David seemed to be searching my face for signs of the compliance he'd expected his children to deliver. How did the visit go? David asked Emma and Tyler. Great, Tyler said enthusiastically. Grandma's not moving after all, so we can still come over whenever we want. The look that passed between David and Jessica was loaded with frustration and anger. They'd clearly expected their children to return home, convinced that my move was inevitable and positive. Instead, Emma and Tyler were more attached to me and my home than ever. We'll discuss this later, Jessica said coldly, ushering the children toward the car. David lingered on my porch for a moment. Mom, you shouldn't have told them you're not moving. Now they're going to be confused and upset when you have to. When I have to, I repeated. David, I'm not moving. I've told you that repeatedly. I don't know why you can't accept that I'm capable of making my own decisions. Because you're not thinking clearly, he said, his voice rising with frustration. You're being stubborn and unrealistic. This house is too big, you're getting older, and whether you want to admit it or not, you need more support than you're getting. According to whom? My doctor says I'm in excellent health. My financial advisor says my affairs are in perfect order. My friends and neighbors see me every day living independently and happily. The only people who think I need assistance are you and Jessica. David's face reddened. Fine. If you won't listen to reason, we'll have to explore other options. But I'm not going to stand by and watch you put yourself in danger because you're too proud to accept help. The threat was unmistakable, though vague enough to maintain plausible deniability. David was suggesting that if I didn't comply with their plans voluntarily, they would find other ways to force my compliance. After they left, I sat in my living room feeling a mixture of anger and sadness. My son, the boy I'd raised to be kind and thoughtful, was now threatening me with unspecified consequences because I refused to surrender my independence. Jessica, the woman who'd promised at Harold's funeral that I would always be family, was now treating me like an inconvenient obligation. But I also felt something else. Determination. David and Jessica had underestimated me, just as difficult doctors and demanding administrators had underestimated me throughout my nursing career. They thought I would cave under pressure, that I would prioritize family harmony over my own well-being. They were about to learn how wrong they were. That evening, I called Robert Morrison to update him on the latest developments. When I told him about David's veiled threat and Jessica's use of the grandchildren as emotional leverage, he was deeply concerned. Eleanor, this situation is escalating in troubling ways. The fact that they're involving the children and making threats suggests they may be planning to pursue legal guardianship or conservatorship. We need to move quickly to protect your rights. What does that mean exactly? It means they could petition the court to have you declared incapacitated, which would give them legal authority to make decisions about your living situation, your finances, and your medical care. It's an extreme step, but given their behavior so far, I think we need to be prepared for that possibility. The idea that David and Jessica might try to have me legally declared incompetent was terrifying and infuriating in equal measure. But Robert's warning also crystallized my resolve. If they wanted a fight, they would get one. But they would discover that their opponent was much more formidable than they'd anticipated. The next morning brought an unexpected ally in the form of Martha Henderson, my 74-year-old neighbor who'd lived next door for the past 12 years. Martha had been Harold's and my closest neighbor friend, and since his death, she'd become like a sister to me. She knocked on my back door just as I was finishing my morning coffee, carrying a plate of fresh blueberry muffins and wearing the determined expression I'd learned to associate with her crusading moods. "Eleanor, I need to talk to you about something," she said, settling herself at my kitchen table with the authority of someone who'd earned the right to speak her mind. "Yesterday afternoon, I saw that daughter-in-law of yours walking around your property with a man in a suit, pointing at things and taking notes. They spent about 20 minutes looking at your roof, your gutters, even your garden shed. When I asked Jessica what they were doing, she said they were getting estimates for repairs that needed to be done before you moved. My blood ran cold. Jessica had brought someone to assess my property without my permission, probably documenting every minor maintenance issue that could be used as evidence that I was unable to care for my home properly. Did you recognize the man?" "I didn't, but I wrote down his license plate number and the name on his truck, Henderson Home Inspections. I called my nephew who works in real estate, and he said it sounds like they were doing a pre-sale inspection. Pre-sale inspection. They weren't just planning to move me to assisted living, they were planning to sell my house. The home Harold and I had built together, where I'd raised David, where every room held memories of our life together, was being evaluated like a commodity, to be liquidated. Martha, did Jessica have any legal right to authorize that inspection? Not that I know of. This is your property, and as far as I know, you haven't given anyone permission to sell it. Eleanor, I think your son and his wife are planning something much bigger than just moving you to a retirement home. Martha's words confirmed my worst fears. This wasn't just about assisted living. It was about liquidating all my assets. If they could get me declared incompetent, they could sell my house, access my bank accounts, and control my entire estate while I was still alive. I would become a powerless ward of their manipulation, dependent on their goodwill for everything from spending money to medical decisions. What are you going to do? Martha asked. I'm going to fight back, I said, feeling a familiar surge of the determination that had carried me through 4 decades of nursing. And I'm going to need your help. Martha smiled grimly. I was hoping you'd say that. I've been watching this situation develop for months, and I've been getting more and more concerned about the way David and Jessica have been treating you. What do you need me to do? First, I need you to document everything you've observed. Write down dates, times, who was here, what they did. If they come back without my permission, I need you to take pictures if you can. Second, I need you to be a witness to my competency. If this goes to court, I'll need people who can testify that I'm perfectly capable of caring for myself. You've got it. And Eleanor, you should know that several other neighbors have noticed what's been going on. Betty from across the street mentioned to me last week that she thought it was strange how Jessica always seemed to be criticizing something about your house or your appearance. And Jim from 2 doors down said he was surprised when David told him you were moving because you seemed so happy and independent. The fact that my neighbors had noticed the pattern of criticism and control was both validating and embarrassing. I'd tried so hard to maintain the appearance of a happy family that I hadn't realized how obvious the dysfunction had become to outside observers. Martha, there's something else. I think David and Jessica are planning to have me declared legally incompetent so they can take control of my finances and force me into assisted living. My attorney thinks they might petition for guardianship. Martha's face hardened. Over my dead body. Eleanor, you're one of the sharpest people I know. You manage your own investments. You maintain this property beautifully. You're active in the community. Any judge who declares you incompetent would have to be blind or corrupt. Her fierce loyalty touched me deeply. Martha had become the sister I'd never had, the friend who saw me clearly and valued me for who I was, rather than what I could provide. Thank you, Martha. I don't know what I'd do without you. You'll never have to find out. Now what's our next move? Over the next hour, we developed a plan that would have made Harold proud of its thoroughness and strategic thinking. Martha would coordinate with our other neighbors to document any unauthorized visits to my property. She would also help me organize a support network of friends and community members who could testify to my competency if needed. Meanwhile, I would work with Robert Morrison to accelerate the legal protections we'd discussed. I would also document every interaction with David and Jessica, creating a paper trail that showed their pattern of manipulation and coercion. Most importantly, I would take back control of the narrative. Instead of responding defensively to their attacks on my competency, I would go on the offensive, demonstrating my independence and capability in ways that would be impossible to dispute. My first step was to schedule a comprehensive home inspection with a reputable company, one that I chose and paid for myself. If David and Jessica wanted to use the condition of my property as evidence that I couldn't maintain it, I would get professional documentation proving otherwise. The inspector, a thorough woman named Carol Stevens, spent 3 hours going through every aspect of my house from the foundation to the roof. Her report, delivered 2 days later, was exactly what I'd hoped for. My home was in excellent condition for its age, with only minor maintenance items that were completely normal for any property. Mrs. Whitman, Carol told me as she handed over the report, I've inspected hundreds of homes, and yours is better maintained than most houses half its age. Whoever told you this property was becoming too much for you to handle was either mistaken or had ulterior motives." Armed with Carol's report, I felt ready to face whatever David and Jessica threw at me next. But their next move came from an unexpected direction. My bank. On Friday morning, I received a call from Jennifer Walsh, the branch manager at First National Bank, where I'd done business for over 30 years. "Mrs. Whitman, I hope you don't mind me calling, but I wanted to follow up on the inquiry we received yesterday about your accounts." "What kind of inquiry?" "Your son David came in asking about your financial situation. He said he was concerned about your ability to manage your money and wanted to know about setting up joint accounts or getting access to your statements. I told him that we couldn't discuss your accounts without your written permission, but I thought you should know about his visit." My hands began to shake with anger. David had gone behind my back to my bank, trying to access information about my finances without my knowledge or consent. This wasn't the behavior of a concerned son. It was the behavior of someone planning to take control of assets that didn't belong to him. "Jennifer, I want to be very clear. David does not have my permission to access any information about my accounts, and I do not want him added to any of my accounts. If he comes back, please ask him to leave." "Absolutely, Mrs. Whitman. I also wanted to mention that we offer some additional security measures for customers who are concerned about unauthorized access attempts. We can set up special passwords, require photo identification for any inquiries, and flag your accounts for extra protection." I immediately implemented every security measure the bank offered. If David and Jessica were going to try to access my money, they would find themselves blocked at every turn. That afternoon, I received an unexpected phone call from Dr. Patricia Kellerman, a geriatrician I'd never heard of. "Mrs. Whitman, I'm calling because your son David has scheduled an appointment for you next Tuesday. He's concerned about some cognitive changes he's observed and wants to have you evaluated." The audacity was breathtaking. David had scheduled a medical appointment for me without my knowledge, probably hoping to get a doctor to document cognitive problems that would support a competency challenge. "Dr. Kellerman, I did not schedule that appointment, and I will not be keeping it. I have my own doctor, Dr. Sarah Chen, who sees me regularly and has found no cognitive issues whatsoever." "I see. Well, that's certainly your right. I'll cancel the appointment and note that you declined the evaluation. Doctor, can I ask you something? When David called to schedule this appointment, what did he tell you about my condition?" Dr. Kellerman hesitated. He mentioned memory problems, confusion about daily tasks, and some concerning incidents of poor judgment. He seemed quite worried about your safety. Every allegation was false, fabricated to create a medical record that could be used against me. David was systematically building a case for my incompetency, using lies and manipulation to convince professionals that I needed intervention. After hanging up with Dr. Kellerman, I immediately called Dr. Chen's office to schedule a follow-up appointment. If David was trying to create a false medical narrative, I needed current, accurate documentation of my actual condition. Dr. Chen saw me the next Monday morning and was appalled when I told her about David's attempts to have me evaluated by another doctor based on fabricated symptoms. "Eleanor, this is deeply concerning behavior. What your son is doing could be considered a form of medical fraud. He's essentially lying to healthcare providers to try to get a diagnosis that serves his purposes, rather than reflecting your actual condition. Can you help me protect myself medically? I'm worried that David might try to get me committed or declared incompetent based on false information." "Absolutely. I'm going to do a comprehensive evaluation today and document everything thoroughly. I'm also going to write a letter for your attorney stating that, in my professional opinion, you show no signs of cognitive decline or inability to care for yourself. Finally, I'm going to put a note in your medical record that any requests for information or appointments made by family members should be verified directly with you." Dr. Chen's examination was even more thorough than usual. She tested my memory, my problem-solving abilities, my physical coordination, and my emotional state. She also asked detailed questions about my daily activities, my social connections, and my ability to manage complex tasks like finances and home maintenance. "Eleanor," she said when we finished, Your cognitive function is excellent. Your memory is sharp, your judgment is sound, and your emotional well-being is good, despite the stress your family is putting you under. Any medical professional who would declare you incompetent based on your current condition would be committing malpractice. Having Dr. Chen's official documentation felt like putting on armor. David and Jessica could lie to other doctors, but they couldn't dispute the findings of a physician who knew me well and had examined me thoroughly. My next stop was Robert Morrison's office, where I shared all the latest developments. The unauthorized property inspection, David's visit to my bank, the appointment he'd scheduled with a geriatrician based on false information. Robert listened with growing concern and anger. "Eleanor, this is escalating quickly, and David's behavior is crossing legal lines. Attempting to access your bank accounts without permission, scheduling medical appointments without your consent, and providing false information to healthcare providers could all be considered forms of elder abuse. We need to move aggressively to protect you. What can we do? First, I'm going to draft a cease and desist letter that clearly establishes your competency and demands that David and Jessica stop interfering with your affairs. Second, I'm going to file paperwork with the court establishing your wishes regarding your care and living situation, making it much harder for them to claim you need guardianship. Third, I'm going to help you revise your will and estate planning documents to reflect the current situation." "Revise my will? What do you mean?" Robert leaned forward, his expression serious. "Eleanor, I think you need to consider whether David and Jessica should remain your primary beneficiaries given their current behavior. If they're willing to lie and manipulate to control your life while you're alive, what makes you think they'll respect your wishes after you're gone?" The suggestion hit me like a physical blow. For 68 years, I'd assumed that my assets would naturally pass to my son and his family. The idea of changing that felt like severing the last connection between David and me, acknowledging that our relationship had deteriorated beyond repair. But as I sat in Robert's office thinking about everything that had happened over the past 2 weeks, I realized that David and Jessica had already severed our relationship. Their actions had shown that they valued my money more than my autonomy, my assets more than my well-being. They'd been willing to lie, manipulate, and coerce to get what they wanted. Why should I reward that behavior with an inheritance? "What are my options?" I asked. "You have complete freedom to distribute your assets however you choose. You could reduce David's inheritance, establish conditions he would have to meet to receive it, or redirect some or all of your estate to other beneficiaries, charities, friends, distant relatives, your grandchildren directly." The mention of Emma and Tyler brought tears to my eyes. Those children loved me for who I was, not what I could give them. If I was going to leave a legacy, shouldn't it go to people who valued our relationship, rather than people who saw me as a burden to be managed? "I want to think about this," I told Robert. "But in the meantime, what about the immediate situation? How do I stop David and Jessica from continuing to interfere with my life?" The cease and desist letter should help. But Eleanor, I have to warn you. If they're determined to pursue guardianship, this could become a very public and unpleasant legal battle. Are you prepared for that? I thought about Harold and how he'd faced his cancer diagnosis with calm determination. He'd never let the disease define him or control his choices. He'd fought when fighting made sense and accepted what he couldn't change, but he'd never given up his dignity or his autonomy. "I'm prepared to do whatever it takes to remain in control of my own life," I said. "If David and Jessica want a legal battle, they'll get one. But they're going to discover that their mother is tougher than they thought." Robert smiled with what looked like approval. "I think they're in for quite a surprise." That evening, I sat in Harold's study reading through our original will and estate planning documents. Everything had been set up with such love and hope for the future. We'd assumed that David would grow into a man who would honor our values and use his inheritance wisely. We'd never imagined that he would become someone who would try to steal my independence while I was still alive. As I read through the documents, I found a letter Harold had written to me shortly before his death, one I'd forgotten about in the grief of losing him. His handwriting was shaky from the chemotherapy, but his words were clear and strong. "My dearest Eleanor," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and you're facing life without me. I know how strong you are, how capable, how intelligent. Don't let anyone, including our son, convince you that you're anything less than the remarkable woman I married 43 years ago. You have the right to live your life on your own terms for as long as you're able. Don't let guilt or obligation trap you into decisions that aren't right for you. I love you always, Harold. Reading Harold's words felt like receiving his blessing for the fight I was about to wage. He'd known me better than anyone, and he'd trusted me to make good decisions about my own life. That trust felt more valuable than any inheritance I could leave to David. The next morning brought a visit from Jessica, who arrived unannounced just as I was finishing breakfast. She looked different somehow, more formal and less friendly than usual. When I opened the door, she walked into my house without being invited, settling herself in my living room like she owned the place. "Eleanor, we need to talk," she said without preamble. "David and I are very concerned about your recent behavior. We've heard that you've been making wild accusations about us, telling people that we're trying to steal your money or force you into assisted living against your will. The gaslighting was so blatant it took my breath away. Jessica was trying to make me doubt my own perceptions, to make me believe that my legitimate concerns were signs of paranoia or confusion. Jessica, I haven't made any wild accusations. I've told the truth about what you and David have been doing. Scheduling medical appointments without my consent, visiting my bank to try to access my accounts, inspecting my property without permission, and using my grandchildren to pressure me into moving somewhere I don't want to go." Jessica's composure slipped slightly. "We're trying to help you, Eleanor. We're worried about your judgment lately. You're not thinking clearly about what's best for you." "According to whom?" "My doctor says I'm thinking perfectly clearly. My attorney says I'm thinking clearly. My neighbors and friends say I'm thinking clearly. The only people who think there's something wrong with my judgment are you and David." "Well, maybe that should tell you something," Jessica said, her voice growing sharper. "Maybe when the people who love you most are concerned, you should listen instead of fighting us every step of the way." The manipulation was sophisticated. Jessica was reframing her and David's controlling behavior as love, and my resistance as evidence of impaired judgment. She was trying to make me feel guilty for defending myself, as if setting boundaries was a form of selfishness. "Jessica, if you and David loved me, you would respect my wishes about my own life. You would ask what I wanted, instead of deciding what was best for me. You would support my independence instead of trying to undermine it." "Your independence?" Jessica laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Eleanor, you're 68 years old. Your independence is an illusion. What happens when you fall down those stairs? What happens when you can't remember to take your medications? What happens when you leave the stove on and burn the house down?" Every scenario she painted was hypothetical, designed to make me afraid of my own life, my own choices, my own future. "Jessica, none of those things have happened. You're asking me to give up my life based on problems that exist only in your imagination. They're not imagination, they're inevitabilities. Eleanor, whether you want to admit it or not, you're getting old. You need help, and David and I are the only family you have. We're trying to make sure you're taken care of before something terrible happens." The conversation was going in circles, with Jessica repeating the same manipulative arguments and me defending the same basic principles. But I realized that this visit wasn't really about convincing me of anything. Jessica was here to gather information, to assess my mental state, to document my responses for whatever legal action they were planning. "Jessica, I think this conversation has gone on long enough. I've made my position clear. I'm not moving to assisted living. I don't need your help managing my affairs, and I want you and David to stop interfering with my life. Eleanor, you're making a mistake. We're trying to do this the easy way, but if you force us to, we'll do it the hard way. David doesn't want to see you hurt, but he won't stand by and watch you put yourself in danger." The threat was clearer this time. If I didn't comply voluntarily, they would pursue legal action to force my compliance. They would try to have me declared incompetent and take control of my life through the courts. "Jessica, I think you should leave now." She stood up slowly, her expression cold and calculating. "You know, Eleanor, I used to feel sorry for you. Living alone in this big house, missing Harold, trying to maintain some dignity in your old age. But now I see that you're just a selfish old woman who cares more about being stubborn than about her own family's peace of mind." The insult was designed to hurt, to make me doubt myself, to make me wonder if I really was being selfish by insisting on my own autonomy. But instead of feeling hurt, I felt clarity. This was who Jessica really was beneath the performance of caring daughter-in-law, someone who felt entitled to control my life and who resented any resistance to her plans. "Goodbye, Jessica," I said, walking to the front door and holding it open. After she left, I sat in my living room feeling shaken but also strangely relieved. The mask had finally come off. Jessica was no longer pretending to care about my well-being. She was openly threatening me with consequences if I didn't surrender my independence. David and I were headed for a legal battle, but at least now I knew exactly what I was fighting. I called Robert Morrison immediately to report the conversation and was gratified by his outraged response. "Eleanor, what Jessica said constitutes intimidation and harassment. She's essentially threatening you with involuntary commitment if you don't comply with their demands. We need to document this conversation and prepare for them to escalate their legal tactics. What should I expect? They'll probably file a petition claiming you're incapacitated and unable to care for yourself. They'll need medical evidence to support their claim, which is why David tried to get you evaluated by that geriatrician. When that didn't work, they may try to find a doctor who will support their position based on David's false reports of your condition. Can they do that? Can they get a doctor to declare me incompetent without examining me? It's difficult but not impossible, especially if they find an unethical physician who's willing to rubber stamp their petition. That's why it's so important that we have Dr. Chen's thorough evaluation and documentation of your competency." Over the next few days, I threw myself into preparations for the legal battle I now knew was coming. I organized all my financial documents, medical records, and evidence of my competency. I wrote detailed accounts of every interaction with David and Jessica, creating a timeline that showed their pattern of manipulation and coercion. Martha helped me contact neighbors and friends who could serve as character witnesses, people who interacted with me regularly and could testify to my independence and capability. Betty from across the street agreed to document the excellent condition of my property and garden. Jim from down the block offered to testify about our regular conversations and his observations of my mental acuity. Dr. Chen wrote a comprehensive letter for my legal file, stating in clear medical terms that I showed no signs of cognitive decline or inability to care for myself. She also noted that any claims to the contrary would be inconsistent with her professional observations and medical findings. My financial advisor, Patricia Williams, prepared a report showing that I managed my own investments competently and had made no unusual or concerning financial decisions. My bank provided documentation showing that my accounts were in good order and that I'd never shown any signs of confusion or impairment in my financial dealings. By the end of the week, I had assembled a comprehensive file that demonstrated my competency from every possible angle: medical, financial, social, and practical. If David and Jessica wanted to challenge my independence, they would have to overcome a mountain of evidence that contradicted their claims. But I also did something else, something that felt both liberating and heartbreaking. I revised my will. Working with Robert, I restructured my estate to reflect the current reality of my family relationships. David would still inherit something, but not the majority of my assets. Instead, I established educational trusts for Emma and Tyler that they could access when they turned 25. I created substantial donations to charities I cared about: the hospital where I'd worked, the animal shelter where I volunteered, the literacy program at the local library. Most importantly, I included a detailed explanation of my decisions, documenting David and Jessica's behavior, and explaining why I'd chosen to redirect my legacy toward people and organizations that valued me for who I was, rather than what I could provide. "Eleanor," Robert said as I signed the new documents, "I've been practicing law for 30 years, and I've rarely seen someone handle a situation like this with such dignity and strategic thinking. David and Jessica have no idea what they've awakened." Harold used to say that the best way to deal with bullies was to be smarter, more prepared, and more determined than they were, I replied. "I think he would approve of what I'm doing. I think he would be very proud." As I drove home from Robert's office, I felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks: peace. I'd done everything I could to protect myself legally and financially. I'd assembled a support network of friends and professionals who believed in my competency and independence. I'd documented every instance of David and Jessica's manipulation and coercion. Most importantly, I'd reclaimed control of my own narrative. Instead of responding defensively to their attacks, I'd gone on the offensive, demonstrating my capability in ways that would be impossible to dispute. That evening, I sat in my garden watching the sunset and thinking about the journey that had brought me to this point. 3 weeks ago, I'd been a lonely widow trying to maintain family harmony at the expense of my own well-being. I'd enabled David and Jessica's controlling behavior by prioritizing their comfort over my own autonomy. Now I was a woman who knew her own worth and was willing to fight for her own rights. I'd learned the difference between love and manipulation, between family and exploitation, between helping and enabling. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Emma, calling from her friend's house where she was spending the night. "Grandma Eleanor, I just wanted to tell you that I love you. Mom and Dad seem really upset about something, and they keep talking in whispers about you. I wanted to make sure you were okay." Hearing my granddaughter's voice, so full of genuine concern and affection, reminded me of what I was really fighting for. I wasn't just defending my independence, I was defending my right to remain connected to the people who truly loved me. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Your mom and dad are just worried about some grown-up things that aren't your concern. But I want you to know that no matter what happens, I will always be your grandmother, and I will always love you more than words can say." "I love you too, Grandma. Can Tyler and I still come over next weekend to help you with the garden?" "Of course you can. I'm counting on it." After hanging up, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. David and Jessica might be planning to wage war against my independence, but they'd forgotten something crucial. I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for my right to remain a loving presence in Emma and Tyler's lives, to be the grandmother they deserved rather than the warehoused old woman their parents wanted to create. The battle ahead would be difficult, but I was ready. I had the law on my side, medical evidence supporting my competency, financial resources to mount a strong defense, and a network of people who believed in me. Most importantly, I had something David and Jessica had lost sight of in their quest for control: the absolute certainty that I was worth fighting for. The war for my independence was about to begin, and I intended to win. The legal papers arrived on a Tuesday morning, exactly 3 weeks after David's initial email about assisted living. The process server was a kind, older gentleman who seemed uncomfortable delivering documents to someone who clearly didn't match the profile of an incompetent elderly person in need of guardianship. "Ma'am, I'm required to serve you with these papers," he said apologetically. "Your son, David Whitman, has filed a petition with the county court requesting emergency guardianship over your person and estate. There's a hearing scheduled for next Friday at 9 in the morning. Emergency guardianship, the most extreme legal remedy available, typically reserved for people who were in immediate danger due to severe cognitive impairment or mental illness." David and Jessica were claiming that I posed such a risk to myself that the court needed to intervene immediately to protect me. I thanked the process server and took the papers inside, my hands surprisingly steady as I read through the allegations David had made under oath. According to the petition, I was suffering from dementia that made me unable to care for myself safely. I was reportedly confused about basic daily activities, unable to manage my finances properly, and living in a home that was falling into dangerous disrepair. The petition claimed that I'd been forgetting to eat regularly, leaving appliances on, and showing signs of paranoid thinking by accusing family members of trying to harm me. It alleged that I'd recently become hostile and aggressive toward people who were trying to help me, and that I was at immediate risk of injury or exploitation if left to live independently. Every single allegation was false, but they were presented with such clinical precision that they painted a picture of a woman who clearly needed immediate intervention. David had even included supporting statements from Jessica and from Dr. Patricia Kellerman, the geriatrician I'd never met, who claimed that my family's reports of my condition were consistent with moderate to severe cognitive decline. The manipulation was breathtaking in its scope and audacity. David had essentially perjured himself in a legal document, creating a fictional version of my mental state to justify seizing control of my life. Dr. Kellerman had provided a professional opinion about a patient she'd never examined, based entirely on secondhand reports that were fabricated lies. I called Robert Morrison immediately, and he arranged to see me that afternoon. When I showed him the petition, his face grew grim with anger and concern. "Eleanor, this is worse than I expected. Emergency guardianship petitions are usually granted quickly, because the court assumes that no one would file such serious allegations unless there was genuine cause for concern. We have less than a week to prepare a defense that proves you're competent and that David's allegations are false. Can we do that in such a short time? We can try, but it's going to require an all-out effort. The burden of proof is on us to demonstrate that you don't need a guardian, which means we need to present overwhelming evidence of your competency. We also need to show that David's petition is based on false information, which could expose him to charges of perjury and elder abuse." Robert outlined our strategy with military precision. We would present medical evidence from Dr. Chen proving my cognitive competency. We would provide financial documentation showing my ability to manage complex monetary decisions. We would call character witnesses who could testify to my independence and mental acuity. Most importantly, we would demonstrate that David's allegations were contradicted by objective evidence of my actual condition and capabilities. "Eleanor, I have to warn you, this hearing is going to be brutal. David's attorney will try to paint you as a confused, paranoid old woman who doesn't understand her own limitations. They'll twist everything you say and do to support their narrative of incompetence. Are you prepared for that level of attack?" I thought about Harold facing his cancer treatments, enduring chemotherapy and radiation with quiet dignity because he was fighting for more time with the people he loved. I thought about my 40 years in nursing, advocating for patients who couldn't advocate for themselves, standing up to doctors and administrators who tried to cut corners on care. "Robert, I've spent my entire adult life fighting for what's right. I'm not going to stop now just because the fight is about my own life instead of someone else's." The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. Dr. Chen agreed to testify on my behalf and spent hours preparing detailed medical testimony about my cognitive and physical condition. She also arranged for me to undergo additional neuropsychological testing with a specialist who could provide expert testimony about my mental acuity. Martha organized my neighborhood support network, collecting written statements from people who interacted with me regularly and could attest to my independence and competency. Betty documented the excellent condition of my property with photographs that contradicted David's claims about dangerous disrepair. Jim agreed to testify about our regular conversations and his observations of my mental sharpness. My financial advisor prepared comprehensive documentations showing that I managed complex investments competently and had made no unusual or concerning financial decisions. My bank provided records proving that my accounts were in perfect order and that I'd never shown any signs of confusion in my financial dealings. Most importantly, Robert arranged for me to undergo a comprehensive competency evaluation with Dr. Michael Stevens, a forensic psychologist who specialized in guardianship cases. Dr. Stevens spent 6 hours with me over 2 sessions, conducting every type of cognitive and psychological test imaginable. "Mrs. Whitman," he told me after completing his evaluation, "your cognitive function is exceptional for someone of any age, let alone 68. Your memory, problem-solving abilities, judgment, and emotional regulation are all well within normal ranges. Any claim that you're incompetent would be contradicted by objective psychological testing." By Thursday evening, we'd assembled a defense that Robert described as the most comprehensive he'd ever prepared for a guardianship hearing. We had expert medical testimony, objective psychological testing, character witnesses, financial documentation, and photographic evidence that contradicted every allegation in David's petition. But I also did something else that felt both necessary and heartbreaking. I wrote letters to Emma and Tyler, explaining what was happening in terms they could understand, and assuring them that whatever the outcome of the legal proceedings, my love for them would never change. "My dear Emma and Tyler," I wrote, "by the time you read this letter, you'll probably know that your father and I have had a serious disagreement about my life and my future. I want you to understand that this disagreement is between adults and has nothing to do with how much I love you or how much you mean to me. No matter what happens, you will always be my precious grandchildren, and I will always be proud of the wonderful young people you're becoming." I gave the letters to Martha with instructions to deliver them to the children if the court hearing didn't go in my favor. I couldn't bear the thought of Emma and Tyler thinking I'd abandon them if David and Jessica succeeded in having me institutionalized. Friday morning dawned clear and bright, a beautiful spring day that seemed to mock the gravity of what was about to happen in the courthouse. I dressed carefully in my best navy suit, the one I'd worn to Harold's funeral, and arrived at the courthouse 30 minutes early with Robert and Martha. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with simple wooden benches and fluorescent lighting that gave everything a harsh, institutional feel. David and Jessica were already there with their attorney, a sharp-looking woman in an expensive suit who radiated confidence and aggression. Seeing David across the courtroom was like looking at a stranger. The son I'd raised, the boy who'd cried when he accidentally stepped on bugs, had become a man who was willing to destroy his own mother's life for money and convenience. Jessica sat beside him looking triumphant, as if she'd already won a victory she'd been planning for months. Judge Patricia Henley was a stern-looking woman in her 50s, who'd built her career on family law and elder care cases. She called the hearing to order with an efficiency that suggested she'd handled hundreds of similar cases and expected this one to follow a predictable pattern. David's attorney, Linda Crawford, presented their case with polished precision. She painted a picture of a loving son who was desperately worried about his mother's declining mental state and deteriorating living conditions. She read excerpts from Dr. Kellerman's report, diagnosing moderate cognitive decline based on family reports. She showed photographs of minor maintenance issues around my property that she claimed demonstrated my inability to care for myself safely. Your Honor, Crawford concluded, Mr. Whitman is not seeking guardianship out of convenience or financial gain. He's seeking to protect a beloved mother who is no longer capable of protecting herself. The evidence clearly shows that Mrs. Whitman is suffering from cognitive decline that makes her unable to recognize her own limitations or accept help from people who love her. When Crawford finished, Judge Henley turned to Robert with an expression that suggested she was already inclined to grant David's petition. Emergency guardianship hearings were typically brief proceedings where the court erred on the side of caution, assuming that family members wouldn't seek such drastic intervention unless it was genuinely necessary. But Robert had prepared for exactly this assumption. Instead of making legal arguments, he began by calling Dr. Chen to the witness stand. Dr. Chen testified with the authority of someone who'd been practicing medicine for 25 years and knew the difference between genuine cognitive decline and fabricated symptoms. She described her recent comprehensive examination of me, the normal results of all cognitive testing, and her professional opinion that I showed no signs of dementia or mental incapacity. Doctor, Robert asked, in your medical opinion, does Mrs. Whitman require a guardian to protect her from harm? Absolutely not. Mrs. Whitman is one of the most mentally acute patients I treat. She manages complex medical information, makes informed decisions about her care, and demonstrates excellent judgment in all our interactions. Any claim that she's incompetent would be inconsistent with objective medical evidence. Robert then called Dr. Stevens, the forensic psychologist, who testified about the extensive competency evaluation he'd conducted. Dr. Stevens described my performance on cognitive tests, my emotional stability, and my demonstrated ability to understand complex information and make reasoned decisions. Dr. Stevens, Robert asked, have you reviewed the allegations made in Mr. Whitman's petition regarding his mother's mental state? I have, and they are completely inconsistent with my findings. Mrs. Whitman's cognitive function is excellent. She shows no signs of dementia, confusion, or impaired judgment. The symptoms described in the petition either don't exist or have been grossly mischaracterized. Judge Henley was beginning to look skeptical of David's claims, but Robert wasn't finished. He called Martha to the witness stand to testify about her daily interactions with me and her observations of my independence and competency. Mrs. Henderson, Robert asked, you live next door to Mrs. Whitman and see her regularly. Have you observed any signs of confusion, memory problems, or inability to care for herself? None whatsoever. Eleanor is one of the sharpest people I know. She maintains her property beautifully, manages her own affairs without any problems, and is actively involved in our community. The idea that she needs a guardian is ridiculous. Robert then called my financial advisor, who testified about my competent management of complex investments and my consistent demonstration of sound financial judgment. He called my bank manager, who confirmed that I'd never shown any signs of confusion or impairment in my financial dealings. Finally, Robert called me to testify on my own behalf. As I walked to the witness stand, I saw David avoiding my eyes while Jessica watched with barely concealed hostility. Robert asked me to describe my daily routine, my social activities, my health status, and my ability to manage my own affairs. I answered each question clearly and comprehensively, demonstrating the mental acuity that David claimed I lacked. Mrs. Whitman, Robert asked, "Do you understand the nature of these proceedings and what your son is asking the court to do?" "Yes, I understand completely. My son is asking this court to declare me incompetent so that he can force me to move to an assisted living facility against my will and take control of my financial assets. He's doing this not because I need protection, but because he and his wife want access to my money and find my independence inconvenient." Judge Henley looked surprised by my directness. "Mrs. Whitman, those are serious allegations. Do you have any evidence to support your claims about your son's motivations?" Robert handed me a folder containing documentation of everything David and Jessica had done: the unauthorized property inspection, the attempts to access my bank accounts, the false medical appointment, the threats and manipulation. I described each incident calmly and factually, letting the evidence speak for itself. When I finished testifying, Judge Henley called for a brief recess. During the break, I watched David and Jessica huddled with their attorney, who looked increasingly concerned as she realized that their carefully constructed case was falling apart. When court reconvened, Crawford attempted to salvage their position by calling David to testify about his observations of my supposed decline. But under Robert's cross-examination, David's lies began to unravel. "Mr. Whitman," Robert asked, "you claim your mother has been forgetting to eat regularly. Do you have any evidence of weight loss or malnutrition?" "Well, no, but I've noticed she seems confused about meal times." "When specifically did you observe this confusion?" David hesitated, realizing he couldn't provide specific examples because his allegations were fabricated. "It's been an ongoing concern over several months." "Mr. Whitman, you claim your mother's house is in dangerous disrepair. Have you ever offered to help her with maintenance or suggested hiring professionals to address these supposed problems?" "We've discussed it, but she refuses help." "But you never actually offered help, did you? Instead, you hired an inspector to document problems without your mother's knowledge or consent, correct?" David's face reddened. "We were trying to get an objective assessment of the situation." "An objective assessment for what purpose, Mr. Whitman? Were you planning to sell your mother's house?" Crawford objected, but the damage was done. David had essentially admitted that he'd been planning to liquidate my assets without my consent. Robert continued his methodical destruction of David's credibility, exposing the lies and contradictions in his testimony. When he finished, David looked defeated, and Jessica looked furious. Judge Henley deliberated for only 10 minutes before returning with her decision. After reviewing all the evidence presented today, this court finds that Mrs. Eleanor Whitman is fully competent to manage her own affairs and make decisions about her own life. The petition for emergency guardianship is denied. The relief I felt was overwhelming, but Judge Henley wasn't finished. Furthermore, this court is deeply concerned about the false allegations made in Mr. Whitman's petition. The evidence clearly shows that Mrs. Whitman is not suffering from cognitive decline and does not require protection from herself or others. This appears to be an attempt to use the legal system to force an unwanted living arrangement and possibly gain access to Mrs. Whitman's assets. Judge Henley turned to David with an expression of stern disapproval. "Mr. Whitman, filing a guardianship petition based on false information is a serious matter. This court is referring this case to the district attorney's office for possible prosecution for elder abuse and perjury. You should consider yourself fortunate that your mother is choosing not to pursue criminal charges at this time." The hearing was over, but the victory felt bittersweet. I'd defended my independence successfully, but the cost had been the complete destruction of my relationship with my son. As people filed out of the courtroom, David approached me with tears in his eyes. "Mom, I'm sorry. I never wanted it to go this far. Jessica convinced me that we were doing what was best for you, but I realize now how wrong we were." For a moment, looking at my son's anguished face, I felt the old maternal instinct to comfort and forgive. But then I remembered the lies he'd told under oath, the character assassination he'd attempted, the willingness to destroy my life for his own convenience. David, I hope someday you'll understand what you've done. You've broken something between us that can never be completely repaired. If you want any chance of rebuilding our relationship, you need to start by taking responsibility for your actions instead of blaming Jessica for your choices. Jessica, meanwhile, had stormed out of the courtroom without a word, apparently furious that their scheme had backfired so completely. That evening, I sat in my garden with Martha and Dr. Chen, who'd both stayed to celebrate our victory. The setting sun painted everything in golden light, and for the first time in weeks, I felt truly peaceful. Eleanor, Dr. Chen said, what you did today was remarkable. You didn't just defend your legal rights, you demonstrated what dignity and courage look like under pressure. I keep thinking about Harold, I replied. He always said that the best way to honor someone's memory was to live according to the values they believed in. Harold believed in standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Martha raised her glass of wine in a toast. To Eleanor Whitman, who proved that age is just a number, and that family isn't always defined by blood. Over the following weeks, my life gradually returned to a new normal. The legal victory had given me complete freedom to live on my own terms. But it had also forced me to confront the reality that my relationship with David might never recover. Emma and Tyler, however, surprised me with their resilience and wisdom. Despite their parents' attempts to control their contact with me, both children found ways to maintain our relationship. Emma called me regularly from friends, houses, and Tyler convinced his baseball coach to let him walk to my house after practice twice a week. Grandma Eleanor, Emma told me during one of our secret phone calls, Mom and Dad keep saying you were mean to them in court, but Tyler and I know you were just protecting yourself. We're proud of you for being so strong. The children's support meant everything to me, but it also highlighted the ongoing complexity of the situation. David and Jessica continued to limit my access to Emma and Tyler, using the children as pawns in their ongoing resentment about the failed guardianship petition. 3 months after the court hearing, I made a decision that surprised even myself. I sold my house. Not because I couldn't maintain it or because I needed assisted living, but because I realized that I was clinging to a life that no longer served my actual needs and desires. The house was full of memories, but it was also tied to relationships and obligations that had become toxic. I bought a beautiful condominium in a vibrant community 20 minutes away, closer to Martha and my other friends, with a small garden and maintenance-free living that gave me more time for activities I enjoyed. I used the proceeds from selling the house to fund the charitable donations I'd specified in my revised will, making those gifts while I was still alive to see their impact. I also did something that felt both generous and strategic. I established college funds for Emma and Tyler that neither David nor Jessica could access or control. The children would be able to attend any college they chose without being dependent on their parents, financial decisions, or emotional manipulation. The move marked the beginning of what I came to think of as my Renaissance period. Free from the obligation to maintain a house I no longer needed, and relationships that had become destructive, I discovered new passions and purposes. I started volunteering at a legal aid clinic that helped elderly people navigate elder abuse cases, using my experience to help others who were facing similar challenges. I began teaching classes on financial literacy for widows, helping women understand how to protect themselves from family members who might try to exploit their grief and vulnerability. Most surprisingly, I started dating. At 68, I'd assumed that chapter of my life was closed, but I met a wonderful man named Frank at my book club who made me laugh and challenged me intellectually. Harold had been the love of my youth and middle age. Frank became the companion of my Renaissance. A year after the court hearing, I received an unexpected letter from David. It was a genuine apology, written without Jessica's influence during what he described as a period of reflection following their divorce. Mom, the letter said, I've spent the past year in therapy trying to understand how I became the kind of person who would try to steal his own mother's independence. I realize now that I was so afraid of losing control, of not being needed, that I convinced myself you were helpless when you were actually stronger than I ever gave you credit for. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know that I'm working to become the man you raised me to be, the man Dad would have been proud of. The letter moved me deeply, but I wasn't ready to resume a relationship with David. Too much trust had been broken. Too many lies had been told. But for the first time since the guardianship hearing, I felt hope that someday we might find a way to rebuild something positive. Emma and Tyler, now teenagers, had become regular visitors to my new home. Emma was developing into a thoughtful young woman with strong opinions about justice and fairness, clearly influenced by watching her grandmother stand up for herself. Tyler had inherited Harold's dry sense of humor and was already showing signs of the independence and integrity I'd tried to model. "Grandma Eleanor," Emma said during one of our weekend visits, "I've been thinking about what happened with Dad and Mom trying to control your life. I've decided that when I'm an adult, I never want to make decisions for other people who are perfectly capable of making their own decisions." "That's very wise, sweetheart," I replied. "The most loving thing you can do for someone is to respect their right to live their own life, even if you don't always agree with their choices." Tyler, who was helping me plant flowers in my new garden, looked up with a serious expression. "Grandma, do you think Dad has learned that lesson yet?" "I hope so, Tyler. Growing up sometimes takes longer than we'd like, even for adults." On a beautiful spring morning 2 years after the court hearing, I sat in my garden reading the newspaper and drinking coffee with Frank, who'd become a daily part of my life. The phone rang and I saw Martha's name on the caller ID. "Eleanor, you need to turn on Channel 7 right now," she said excitedly. "There's a story about elder abuse prevention, and they're interviewing someone who sounds just like you." I turned on the television to find a reporter interviewing Dr. Chen about a new initiative to help elderly people protect themselves from family members who might try to exploit them. Dr. Chen was describing the importance of legal planning and medical documentation in preventing elder abuse. "We've seen too many cases," Dr. Chen was saying, "where competent elderly people are victimized by their own children, who use fear and manipulation to gain control over their parents' lives and assets. But we've also seen inspiring examples of elderly people who fight back successfully, who prove that age doesn't diminish your right to autonomy and dignity." As I watched, I realized that my fight against David and Jessica had become part of a larger story about elder rights and family exploitation. My individual victory had contributed to awareness and resources that might help other people facing similar challenges. That afternoon, Frank and I drove to the animal shelter where I volunteered, and I was surprised to find Emma and Tyler waiting for me in the parking lot. David was with them, looking nervous but determined. "Mom," David said as I approached, "I was wondering if I could talk to you for a few minutes." "If you're willing." I looked at my son, seeing both the man who'd tried to destroy my independence and the boy I'd raised with such love and hope. He looked older, more humble, somehow smaller than the confident person who'd filed those false legal papers 2 years earlier. "We can talk," I said, "but first, I want to show you something." I led David and the children into the shelter, where I introduced them to the work I'd been doing with elderly people who'd experienced family abuse. I showed them letters from people I'd helped, photographs of other seniors who'd successfully defended their independence, testimonials from lawyers and social workers about the importance of advocacy and education. "Dad," Emma said as we toured the facility, "Grandma Eleanor has become like a hero to lots of people. She's helping them fight back against their own families when they're being mistreated." David listened quietly as shelter staff described the impact of my volunteer work, the number of people I'd helped, the expertise I'd developed in elder rights and abuse prevention. When we finished the tour, he asked if we could sit outside and talk privately. "Mom, I had no idea that what we did to you was part of a bigger pattern," he said. "I thought we were just a family having a disagreement about your living situation. I didn't realize we were perpetrating abuse. David, the reason it felt like a family disagreement to you was because you believed your own justifications. You convinced yourself that you were helping me, instead of recognizing that you were helping yourself. That's how most elder abuse happens. Family members rationalize their behavior as love and concern. How do I make this right? How do I earn back your trust? I looked at my son, this man who'd caused me so much pain but who was also Emma and Tyler's father, Harold's child, the little boy who'd once brought me dandelions like they were roses. David, you start by living differently. You show me through your actions over time that you've learned to respect other people's autonomy. You demonstrate that you understand the difference between love and control. And you accept that earning back trust is a process that can't be rushed or demanded. Will you give me that chance? I'll give you the chance to try. But David, I need you to understand something. I'm not the same person I was 2 years ago. I'm not the mother who enabled your behavior by prioritizing your comfort over my own well-being. I'm not going to sacrifice my independence or my happiness to maintain family peace. If you want a relationship with me, it has to be based on mutual respect. David nodded, tears in his eyes. I understand. And Mom, I want you to know that watching you fight for yourself, seeing how strong and capable you are, has made me proud to be your son in a way I never was before. As we drove home that evening, Frank reached over and squeezed my hand. How do you feel about seeing David again? Hopeful but cautious, I replied. He seems genuinely changed, but I've learned that people can change back just as easily as they can change forward. I'm willing to give him a chance to prove himself, but I'm not willing to make myself vulnerable to being hurt again. 3 years after the guardianship hearing, my life had become richer and more fulfilling than I'd ever imagined possible. My relationship with David was slowly healing, built on new foundations of respect and honesty. Emma and Tyler were thriving as young adults who'd learned valuable lessons about standing up for what's right and respecting other people's choices. My work at the Legal Aid Clinic had expanded into a regional program that helped elderly people across 3 counties protect themselves from exploitation. I'd written a book about my experience that had become a resource for families and professionals dealing with elder abuse issues. Most importantly, I'd proven to myself and others that age is not a barrier to growth, change, and new beginnings. At 71, I was healthier, happier, and more purposeful than I'd been in decades. On a warm summer evening, as I sat in my garden with Frank, Martha, Emma, and Tyler, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. The woman who'd received that first threatening email from David 3 years earlier had been someone who prioritized other people's comfort over her own well-being, who enabled manipulation in the name of family harmony. The woman I'd become was someone who knew her own worth, who defended her own rights, who chose love over guilt and autonomy over obligation. I'd learned that the most loving thing you can do for your family is to model dignity, courage, and self-respect. Harold had always said that the measure of a life wasn't how long you lived, but how fully you lived. In the years since his death, I'd discovered that growing older didn't mean growing smaller, that wisdom wasn't about accepting limitations but about understanding your own power. As the sun set over my garden, surrounded by people who loved and respected me for who I truly was, I felt something I'd never expected to feel again: excitement about the future. At 71, I was just getting started. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.